MED 725. This is Dr. Waymeyer. Kind of an introductory video here. I will apologize ahead of time. I discovered that on these videos, my eyes dart around a lot. I don't know if that's because I'm thinking a lot. We'll go with that. But anyhow, it's kind of odd. You don't know to look at the camera or look at yourself or what. But anyhow, so MED 725, one of my favorite classes. By and large, because we talk about two things that are incredibly important to music education: the history of music ed, where have we been, and then the philosophy of music education, where are we going. There's a lot of other things, details about those two components, but both incredibly important. We all have heard that those who do not know and aren't informed by history are doomed to repeat it, and that's kind of a very negative connotation to learning history. However, there's a lot of truth to it. There's also a lot of truth to be said that we learn from history to continue moving on and keep the things happening that should be happening. So the illusion that all of history is bad is not true. We've done an awful lot of great things in education. Certainly it can be said, and it'd be very difficult to argue, that the United States has the strongest music ed programs of any country in the world. Others would argue that Japan might. And there are some pockets of great music ed happening in Japan, depending on how you define what great music ed is. But mile for mile, rural, suburban, inner city, our support of music ed is incredibly strong. It's very common in our country to talk about us being worried about music programs being cut left and right, which is just not true. They're not being cut left and right. That implies that lots and lots of them are going away. There are some that are being cut, but there are also lots of new ones that are being implemented. We just don't ever hear about that. So it's kind of consensus among professors, those that do lots of research, that music ed is maintaining the number of programs nationwide for the most part. If there is a change, it is down slightly, less than 1% over where we were 10 years ago, 20 years before that. Those statistics also can be skewed a lot because of a lot of different kinds of things. The number of community outreach programs, community music ed things that are happening outside the school has greatly increased over the last 10 years. The number of college differences in college, I'm going to adjust this a little bit. College music offerings has greatly increased over the last couple of years. Some of them are formal training in music, some of them are not. But there we go. So to talk about history a little bit, you have your readings that are assigned for the course. You also have an assignment where you're going to look at a music ed timeline and decide if you think the things that are on there are the most important and you want to keep them, or you think something else is important or something else is more interesting to you. So you're basically coming up with your own timeline, kind of with the thought in mind that if you were to take a comprehensive exam, or to ever teach this class one day, that you would have this timeline you would go back to and go, these are things that I found important or really interesting. Now I think it's very, very important to note that you need to go back to that timeline from time to time and look and decide, well, this used to be important to me and it's not as important now. I'm going to insert this, I'm going to move this over, I'm going to emphasize this more, I'm going to de-emphasize this, so on and so forth. So just some overview things very quickly about history components of music ed, and this probably covers at least the first three or four readings. There's some things in your book about antiquity, Greeks, Romans, prior to that, philosophers, and I think all of that's very, very important. I don't go into a lot of detail on campus with our face-to-face class about that time period. I think it's important to know that lots of things that have been important in the arts, in writing, in academia that are important, all those things we've hung on to because at the time they were deemed important. The years following the death of a philosopher or a teacher or a methodology or a school or a college, we kept records of the things that were incredibly important. Not all the things that were incredibly important, but a lot of them. So we do have some good facts to back up a lot of the music education things that were happening back in these times. I think it's important to note that when things were very, very important, they were often stored in a way that we still have them. However, this does not consider nor allow us to have everything from that time period that was important. Important to talk about how much religion was tied into music, which today it's still incredibly tied into music, but maybe not as much as it was in various time periods, various pockets, various countries, various cultures, civilizations in history. The spread of Christianity, um, based on the life of Jesus Christ. Lots and lots of important implications of that. A lot of important implications as Christianity grows and the Catholic Church becomes incredibly important, and the religious thrust of Europe during these times and on into Renaissance, all the way up until current modern day. Very, very important. Pope Gregory, someone we've all studied about in our undergrad music history. The Gregorian chants that used his name. Some people refer to him as King Gregory in a way because of how much power and control he had at that time. All of these things incredibly important. I also think it's important to note that in music ed and religion during ancient times, that we see Christianity in all of its facets, which include its spread of goodwill, so to speak, its spread of philosophy, its spread of a belief system, and what these do to bring people together. Also, I think it has to be noted all of the Crusades and how many people were killed and oppressed and tortured because of Christianity. And that can be said about a lot of religions. And that, of course, has an impact on music in a lot of places, and the arts in a lot of places, communities, social issues. In particular, of interest to us, because so much of what we do in this country, in the United States, is based out of European traditions. Thus, we call it Western music traditions, Western Hemisphere as opposed to Eastern Hemisphere, and how important religion played a role, Christianity played a role. That Christianity in Europe, largely through the Catholic Church, that then, of course, was challenged over time with acts like Martin Luther and the 95 Theses on the door of a Catholic Church in Germany, and those changes that happened because of him and others like him. It's really fascinating as we look at all of these histories. There's some people that did some very, very brave things that changed the face of religion and music. A lot of what Martin Luther did, some things that John Calvin did, some things that John Marbeck, some people pronounce his last name Marbecki, did for allowing the congregation to have a larger role, a larger part in the service by being able to participate in music, had an awful lot to do with education, the spread of education, not only in Europe, but as Pilgrims and Puritans and Jesuit priests from Spain and other people came to the New World, brought those ideals with them. So, super important as we think about music education in the United States. We also think about, at least to some degree, that the Western Hemisphere includes Canada, North America, Central America, and South America. So a huge landmass of largely Europeans, slave trade, those seeking wealth, Cortez, all these people we've heard about looking for the Fountain Youth, looking for treasures. The nation of Saguenay, I don't know if you've ever heard of this, in Canada. The French were told that there was a land that the Native Americans were telling them about where people could fly and do all these things that seem magical and outer worldly and amazing, I guess you can use that word, fantastical, that were happening, and that music was a big part of that as well. And of course, as Cortez found and as other explorers found, and the people that were looking for Saguenay found, they didn't exist. But we stayed here anyway and have popularized North America, Central America, South America. One thing that's very, very fascinating to me is as Pilgrims and Puritans came to the Upper East Coast, those of us that are American-born, American taught, when we think of people coming here and colonizing, we go there in our brains. If you're from Brazil, you don't do that. If you're from Latin America, Central America, you don't do that. Your history is very, very different. And so I want to address some of that first, because most of us have not been necessarily exposed to the colonization of areas other than North America or specifically the United States. A lot of Spanish explorers brought priests with them, particularly Jesuit priests, that did a lot of things in South America and Central America. There's a great movie with Robert De Niro, some other famous people in it, called The Mission. If you're into movies, if you can sit down and watch a movie that doesn't have to pound you over the head constantly, this might be a movie for you. Some great acting, some beautiful scenery, and wonderful music by Ennio Morricone, who was a film score composer. One of the pieces he wrote for that is called Gabriel's Oboe, Gabriel's Oboe. It talks about these Spanish priests that are coming. They're bringing Western music with them. Some of the Native Americans, I'd say North Americans, South and Central Americans, greatly embraced this music, and sometimes they didn't. They thought it was witchcraft. They thought it was, that's an American term, they thought it was not part of their religious beliefs. It was something evil, evil spirits. It was disturbing the good vibrations from Mother Earth. Whatever their religious beliefs were, that it was contradictory to that. So anyhow, a lot of cool things about this movie that kind of teaches some of that history. But by and large, Native Americans, North America, Central America, South America, embraced Western music, and a lot of it is because their music traditions were never written down. Things were passed from father to son, mother to daughter, so on and so forth. And music being something that we felt, we honored, and not to be perfect, but to be emotional, to be human, to be expressive, to communicate, allowed us to hear music in a way that maybe we don't. If we get a student, we instantly teach them notation, we instantly teach them right and wrong, good sound, bad sound, right rhythm, wrong rhythm. We kind of, in a way, teach them that music is this one thing, and it's one thing only, it's perfection, and that your ability to explore music on your own, explore your own music making, to improv, one of our 9 national standards, is something that we really don't do very well here. In lots of other cultures, people are way more open to sing. If you looked at them and said, sing something for me, they would sing for you. And the thought of being embarrassed to express themselves musically would never cross their minds. Asking them to make up their own song or to play their own tune on whatever instrument that they're playing, they would love to do that. They would love to share a part of who they are with you. And I think because of that, in part, when this Western European music was being heard, they embraced it just like they would anybody else's song that they were going to sing for somebody else or make it for somebody else. And it was just this part of sharing, which is very, very fascinating. Even to the point that on some plantations in the South, in some of the Caribbean islands, natives imitated violins, imitated recorders, imitated clarinets, and made these things out of indigenous materials. And some of these plantation owners found quickly that there were people, slaves brought over from Africa, that were imitating this Western music without the ability to read, and doing it so well that they would hire people who were not trained in Western music, who were from these islands, to come and perform for them because they were more cheaply acquired. They were more easily acquired, and were somewhat novel. So that kind of blew my mind first time I heard that. No, wait. You're saying indigenous peoples, or people that were part of the slave trade, who had no training, didn't speak English, would hear someone playing a violin, go take a gourd or wood, and fashion something that looked like a violin, and be able to play melodies on it that sounded like Mozart, that sounded like Purcell, that sounded like Haydn and Handel? Absolutely. And a lot of this is substantiated through a lot of historical things that have been written. Pretty fascinating. And reasons are far-reaching reasons. Lots of reasons for this happening, but a lot of it's just because of the way other cultures perceive music, how they indulge in music, how they think about music, how music is processed in their heads. Very much like an amazing jazz improviser, where all the notes and all the information is in their head, and they just grab what they want and use it, and it all comes out instantly. And again, so much of Western tradition, traditional training, we don't do that. We're not taught to address music in that way. I'm not saying good or bad. It just helps explain some of these things that we talk about when we talk about history. So very important that we know. The Incas played a large role, Aztecs, in music making. There's lots of records of music being a very important, integral part of their education systems. Keep in mind, however, and we're talking about the same thing in Europe, when we come into North, Central, and South America, as would be in Europe, those that are being educated are largely boys, or by and large boys. If any girls are being educated, they're probably part of royalty or incredibly wealthy families. So when we say education, we have to keep that in mind. Not everybody's going to school. Not everyone's being educated based on their class, how much money they make, where they fit into the class system of the society that they're in. That changes over time, and obviously has changed drastically in the United States, specifically the last 80 or so years. But keep in mind that the further back we go in history, not everyone's being educated, not everyone's being exposed to music education. So when the Incas and the Aztecs were educating their students, not only in music but in other subjects, it was by and large royalty, by and large wealthy, important families. William Penn, who helped found Pennsylvania, was a Quaker, and we've heard of Quakers and Shakers and these religious factions that came from Europe in part because of religious oppression there, that were all factions of Christianity, but had their own belief systems. A lot of them believing in predestination, as a Calvinist one would, someone who follows the beliefs of John Calvin. But played a big role in music and allowing the congregation to participate in music, of course having their different rules about how that happens and doesn't happen. Some of us are familiar with primitive Baptist churches, Church of Christ, different kinds of religions even now, some allowing different types of music, some allowing no live music, or music that's not produced by anything other than acoustic, some churches that don't allow music at all. And all these traditions are still left over from a lot of these religions that came to, these peoples that came to the New World, bringing their music and music traditions with them. Moravians from Germany, very important. Your book talks quite a bit about them, how strong the music tradition was for them, vocally and instrumentally, and that people may not have been completely open to original Moravian music, but were very receptive of them because they brought a lot of the European traditional oratorios and symphonies and those things, and were performing them in the New World, which we would think initially would be very difficult to do, just because of the lack of performance halls and the instruments and large orchestras. Keeping in mind about large orchestras of that time, which may have been 30, 33, 35, 50 people at the most, that it drew attention to the Moravians and what they were doing. And anytime someone does something well, we tend to point and look and go, oh, like that, which is a lot of why Japan has the strong music schools that it does. They followed the American example. After Hiroshima and the end of World War II, Japan started looking to the West to further their advancement, and obviously they've done that quite well. And one of the things that they've taken from Western tradition, and specifically the United States, is music education. If you have time, go online and type in Japanese high school choir, Japanese high school band, Japanese middle school orchestra, and for the most part you're going to be blown away at what they produce. Now, there's a lot to be said for how they produce that and why, and some of it may be good reasons, bad reasons, not so good reasons, better reasons, and all those things play into the idea of philosophy. So, just to recap the history, as we go from ancient times till up to North America, Central America, and South America being colonized. We have to keep in mind that it's all of those places and lots of people from different places, by and large North America or the United States, by the English, Canada by the French, and everything from New Mexico, Arizona, southward, largely by the Spanish, but not completely. The Portuguese, obviously, Portuguese being the dominant language in Brazil. And of course there were some French explorers and some British explorers that came, by and large, those areas being founded primarily by those cultures, English cultures, Spanish, and French, which obviously were the dominant cultures in Europe of that same time. So up through the time period when we do have our Pilgrims and our Puritans and the Jesuit priests and all these things happening, the last thing I'll say, and I think it's important to know, that as the colonies were being formed, 13 colonies, and music education was happening there, that it was also happening in New Mexico and Arizona strongly. Mexico City was a great center for music education. There were more music things being printed in Mexico City at the time, late 1500s, early 1600s, than there were being produced in some major cities in Spain at the time. Just to give us some perspective, we think in our modern day mind sometimes Mexico being a country that's not as well off and things can't be produced as well as they are in the United States, and that's a little racist in some ways or culturally biased in some ways. But to think all the way back to that time period, that a lot of these areas were very, very advanced, and in some ways as advanced, if not more so, than things that were happening in Europe. So the earliest music education that's happening in North America, and specifically in the United States, what's happening in the colonies and what's happening because of Spanish explorers and Spanish priests in New Mexico, Arizona, specifically New Mexico, very strong and very much at the same time, and in some ways more successfully in the Southwest in New Mexico than the colonies for a various amount of reasons. And then just a transition a little bit into the first book produced in the New World. The first book, period. I didn't say music book. First book produced in the New World, and specifically in North America, and specifically in the colonies, was the Bay Psalm book. And this Bay Psalm book was a book of songs, a book of singing instruction. It was very important and an integral part of education in the colonies at that time, and so popular it was also very much used in Europe at the time. So very, very important book. So just in this first quick lecture about the historical aspects, some things for you to think about, some things that you will read about. The book is a great book. It seems to have an awful lot of facts, as it should. Some people think it moves a little too quickly, but I think for the purposes of this class, it's a great book. It's not too long. I do wish the summaries were a little bit better. I think there's some important things left out in the summaries. So if you go to the summaries and just read them and move on, I think you're going to miss an awful lot of information. What's important to me is that timeline. You have something to go back to and go, these things were important in music education. There's no way you're going to memorize every word in the book. There's no way that I can hold you, anybody can hold you responsible for every single thing in the book because there's so many facts in it. But coming up with what you think is important, being able to look at what I think is important by looking at that timeline that you can find in Blackboard, will help you hopefully focus down and come up with something that's very pragmatic and practical to you in your future. If you were to ever teach this class again, you have your own growth in research and music ed. You have some interest there, and maybe as you when they pursue a terminal degree, that the history of music education somehow leads you into some research that you're very, very interested in. And again, I think just knowing history gives us a sense of place, gives us a sense of our past, our history, and helps us just to respect where we've been and hopefully where we're going, which is in that segue into having a philosophy about why we do what we do, based on our history, based on what's happening now, and based on what we think needs to be happening in the future with music ed. So, welcome to class, and I hope you have a great semester. Thanks.